Hi, this is Chuck Wolfe, and welcome to the Emotion Roadmap, my live streaming YouTube, sponsored in part by the Simsbury Media Group. And I want to welcome all of you who have tuned in. I know that many of you know that I'm going to be having a guest on today, and that guest is Zorana Pringle. And now I've gotten to know Zorana through her speaking appearance, really, just where Zorana presented some information about her book called The Creativity Choice. It's a book that's fascinating, and it talks all about the connection between emotion and creativity. And Zorana is probably one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met about that connection. Zorana, could you say a little bit more about yourself then and introduce yourself?
I am a senior research scientist at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and I have been in this field for more than 25 years. My research is on creativity. Really, once we have the ideas, how do we do something with them to transform them and make them come alive? And in this process, emotions are an integral part, even though we sometimes instinctively think of creativity just in terms of thinking and with slogans of think different or think outside the box.
What is it about people, certain people, that allows people to actually take their ideas and finalize them in the sense of turning into a product or service or something new that they create? People who are open to experience is how it begins. You want to say a little bit about that?
This is a personality trait that describes typical ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. And it refers to being imaginative, being flexible in thinking and action, and being interested in intellectual ideas and aesthetic matters. Like other personality traits, comes more naturally to some people than others, but it also turns to be increased by cultural experiences and through education, especially higher education, which exposes people to new relationships, to new places, to new ideas, and in that way can open up ways of thinking. Openness to experience is something that is part of who you are as an individual, makes you more likely to even engage.
Okay, well, one of the things about being open to new experiences is you might find other ways besides higher education, I imagine. But in theory, at least, when you move on to higher education, you're moving out of what's familiar from your particular neighborhood where you grew up and where you went to school. If you happen to have a lifestyle where you're pretty stable in terms of your environment, I imagine other things might as well. If you go off and do volunteer work in some other part of the country and you expose yourself or to a new country, I imagine there's lots of different ways to open yourself up to experiences. Would you agree with that?
Yes, of course. And you are touching on some of the very big ones. So there is wonderful research showing that travel, and in particular, living someplace where you did not grow up for extended period of time, makes a difference in how you're thinking.
That's interesting. When I was many years ago, I had the experience. I was working with young kids in classrooms, teaching them about feelings. Interestingly enough, I remember the concept was something called Magic Circle, and we had a group of children that. Maybe some was from a special education group. Another was an athlete. Somebody else was a musician. I mean, these are the traits that they had even as young kids. Somebody else was very studious. Somebody else was very playful. Somebody was funny. But they weren't necessarily people that would be in a group together normally. But when I asked them a question about, okay, we're going to talk about anger today. And it's going to be a safe space. Everybody, whatever you say is going to be okay. And I just want to ask you, have you ever been angry before? And have you found a way to deal with it successfully? This is way back when. This was pretty interesting because it was a safe environment. And before anybody would answer, they'd have to remember what the person before them said. So you had to increase your listening skills, and you had to say things about what the feeling meant to you. And I'm just thinking about new experiences as you're talking about this. And the experience people had was, wow, I never would necessarily talk to this other person in this group before, but what a great answer they had. I'm going to talk to them after this group. I'm just really interested in the way they're dealing with anger. I'd never thought about that. I think I could use that. Anyway, I was just thinking about lots of different ways people have different kinds and new experiences and how it might open you up to being more creative.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and anything that can open the range of our experiences can become a source of new perspectives and a source of creativity. You are touching on something with your example of students who normally would not interact on something that has been studied in organizational behavior and applying the study of creativity to work and organizations. And researchers have found that reaching out to social circles, to others in our social circle, will have consequences for our creative work. So if you happen to be in the relatively early stages of the creative process, when you are searching for new ideas and new perspectives, it is especially helpful to reach out to those who you don't often interact with. Just like in your example of somebody who is very quiet, interacting with an athlete and a popular individual in the context of school. In the context of work, those might be people who are not in our team, who are not in our division or organization. If we broaden the circle even more, those might be individuals who we are connected with vaguely on professional social media channels such as LinkedIn or through conferences. But at those times when we are developing ideas, we are committed to something and want to elaborate on it, working very closely with those who are similar to us and who can think in similar ways is going to deepen our work.
Well, that's very helpful, and I want to talk also about the idea of the creative process in organizational life, and organizations that want people to be more creative. They want them to create, generate innovative ideas, something new, a new design that's going to give us a product or service that's going to take us to the next level in whatever field we might. You talk about the creative process as having a beginning, sort of a midpoint, and an ending, and you say you don't have a blueprint or a roadmap, so it's different for different people in different circumstances. But there are some things that you've discovered along the way, and I'd like to talk about that from the perspective of this initial uncertainty that comes across for people when they're first starting out. The idea for me of an emotion roadmap is like knowing what I'm likely to feel when that feeling shows up. If it's not helpful and it's actually an obstacle or something, at least something that's causing me to pause and not allow me to move on, can I change that feeling? And that can happen spontaneously, or I can actually know if I read your book and I understand what happens to people along the way, and I know what some of the speed bumps might be in terms of trying to get this done. What do I do when I get there? How do I plan for me to overcome things like uncertainty or anxiety, things that show up around this process? Could you talk a little bit about what you've discovered about the process of being creative from the beginning to the end?
You identified that very precisely, that the start of the creative process is characterized by uncertainty. By very definition of what is creative, that's a great place to start. What is creative? Creativity is something that is in the same time original and effective. Originality is important because without it, we are repeating exact same thing that has been done before. So what's the need? And without effectiveness, we can have original ideas that simply are bizarre. So both criteria are necessary for something to be considered creative. And if we are attempting something that is to a certain extent original, that means that we do not know exactly what we are going to end up with, because we are not repeating something that has been done before. and that is associated with uncertainty. Psychologically, that uncertainty is experienced as risk, and in particular, either intellectual risk that asks whether we could learn those skills and ways of thinking that are necessary to get to our final end, and reputational risk that is asking, well, how are other people going to react? And those are the unknowns of the creative process by the very definition of it. So that is the very first thing that happens.
Well, you're likely to experience a fair amount of uncertainty and also some anxiety, because I know when you set out to do something new, like even doing the live streaming I'm doing right now, you put your reputation at risk. And you have some possible embarrassment if things don't work out. If the technology didn't work, or we were somehow our conversation wasn't stimulating or interesting, so you worry about failure, and you worry about being embarrassed in front of people that you might care about what they think. But you talk about what you hope for at least an emotion where you want to be throughout the process, if possible, is something I loved, which is this idea of creative confidence. So can you tell people what that's about?
Creative confidence is the fuel that gets us going. It is the fuel that starts the drive and maintains us in motion until we get to our goal. So we know very intuitively that confidence matters because we tend to do those things that we believe in. But because creative work starts with uncertainty, part of that uncertainty is whether we can rise to the occasion ourselves. So there is self-doubt that is inherently part of the creative process. The good news is that creative confidence can be built, and it is most strongly built through experience. We decide to engage in a process. As every process, it starts with the first step. It starts with smaller tasks that build towards a bigger goal. And as we engage with those smaller tasks, we complete them. We realize that we are able to complete those. We can look back and say, well, if I did that, I can do the next thing that is on my journey. And that builds confidence. So it might seem, well, you build confidence just with more and more experience, and then you go from some relatively low number to 100%, but it doesn't really work like that because confidence is dynamic in nature. It responds to what goes on with our work. So if we make steady progress, it grows and it grows steadily. However, it is not uncommon to encounter obstacles or to encounter even full-fledged creative blocks. And at those times, creative confidence also is likely to fall, sometimes even precipitously, and we have to rebuild it yet over again.
That talking about creative confidence is in part sometimes comes from the fact that once you've done it one time, you tend to have a stronger belief that, and you're able to deal more effectively with the unpleasant feelings that come by knowing that you've had success in the past.
I very much agree with that description. So we cannot know exactly and cannot plan exactly how long it's going to take or every step of the way along that path of realizing an idea, but we can have an outline of the emotional side of it. And the emotional side will start with that uncertainty. It will have a component of self-doubt that can grow into confidence. But there are other parts, other emotional parts of that lay of the land that will include curiosity. Curiosity is going to push us, motivate us to look for different angles on what we are working on, different ways of engaging, different ideas. Then there is a part of empathy, empathy that makes us consider how the needs of other people. One of my favorite titles of a scientific article of all times is by Adam Grant, and the title is "Necessity of Others is the Mother of Invention." It is by putting ourselves in other people's shoes, we are realizing what problems are that maybe we are not experiencing ourselves, but we know it's an opportunity and the need for innovation. We also can anticipate that there's going to be frustration in the process. Coming back to the nature of the creative work as something that works towards originality, well, we are a little bit in a labyrinth. We are in a maze, and sometimes we end up facing the wall and having to retrace our steps, and that is frustrating. But in the process, we can learn, and the product in the end can be even more creative because of it. Constraints are very frustrating in their own right, but there is reliable research showing that they actually increase creativity of what we are working on.
One of the things that strikes me as I'm listening to you, and also in our earlier conversation and reading your book, is I love the idea of being creative. But I also at one time wondered, is it creative? Does creativity mean being something, when you say original, does that mean it's something that no one ever thought of before? And of course, we both agreed that that's not really possible. People have thought about lots of things, but sometimes it's, at least for me, the combination of things that exist, but in new ways, putting them together in a different way, and in a way perhaps other people hadn't thought of before. And I think about the concept that this emotion roadmap I talked about, which was trying to understand. So we now know that there's such a thing as emotional intelligence. But what do we do with it? How does that help us in our lives? What's the pragmatic view of, now that we have a new science that says there are emotional intelligence abilities, what does that mean to us as individuals, as organizations, as teams, as divisions, as countries even? I was talking with somebody today who's listening, I know, who is from Georgia, the country of Georgia. And, how do we impact countries as well as companies and large organizations as well as small ones? And one of the things that struck me over the years was, I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with the Gallup organization. They constantly are testing, how people are feeling in organizations. And one of the things that they note is that engagement is often something in many companies that is really sought after. You want high levels of engagement with your employees, and engagement is an emotion. And if you're showing up in most companies, what they find across the world, only 20% is typical on average of companies that actually have most of the people, 20% of the people working really hard every day, really pulling for their company to be successful. That means 80% of the people aren't doing what they could. In fact, 15 to 20% might actually be so angry with their organizations that they're looking to sabotage them. So one of the things I've done in the last few years, working with a client that has become a wonderful client and friendship relationship at this point, is to create an emotionally intelligent culture, and try at the heart of what they were doing is to create a set of shared feelings. And in many organizations, this is not a new idea. They've called it shared values. And just as an example, respect as a value is nice to know that you have that with your company, that company's supposed to be respectful. But it's not the same as asking people, do you feel respected in this company? Or asking, as a representative of this company, are you respectful to your peers and to your bosses and your people that might work for you? Are you respectful to community members as a representative of this company, to vendors, to customers? It's a whole nother way of thinking about things. And it's the creative process in that sense with this company has been terrific. The results are great.
That's a great example. The social influences on creativity are great. And it starts with the atmosphere of psychological safety. It is one of those concepts that is talked a lot in our culture, but there are lots of misconceptions about it, either with ideas out there that it's this atmosphere of permissiveness and everybody has the right to say whatever they exactly think in a moment. But it is quite to the contrary, the atmosphere of respect and trust that one's opinions will be accepted and will be treated in a way that we do not have to fear any kind of direct or indirect retribution. So that becomes that emotional nutrient in the ecosystem. But then, as we all know, anybody who has ever worked anywhere knows that leaders create the experience of work for most of us and have an outsized influence on the climate and the culture in teams and in organizations. In my own work at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, we have looked at in a large study across the economy. So this was different industries, representative of the economy at large. And we asked people who worked full-time to describe how their leaders acted, specifically how they acted in relation to emotions. Did they notice how people were feeling? Did they try to motivate others and inspire? Do they understand how their own decisions are influencing the experience of work for their team members? And are they helping people deal with those frustrations and disappointments of work? And we have found that when leaders act in these ways, so when they act in emotional, intelligent ways, it makes a big difference for workers' experience of work, but not just their experience of work, also about what they do. And as they experience more positive feelings, they are feelings of a particular nature, feelings of being motivated, being challenged, yet fulfilled and loving their work. As a consequence of it is that they engage in more creative behavior and work and end up being more innovative in their jobs.
That's great. As I'm listening, I'm thinking about Helen Reese's work. Another colleague of ours is an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and she has her own company called Empathetics. And Helen shared with us at the last consortium meeting some unbelievable statistics about how helpful it has been since her company has started to teach empathy inside large hospitals and organizations dealing with medical treatments and medical care. There's a tremendous burnout rate in a lot of places in the healthcare industry, as most people already recognize these days that have had to deal with the healthcare industry. And yet when she teaches people about being more empathic, and I love that there's several ways to define empathy. One is the intellectual empathy, which is understanding why you feel the way you do. Emotional empathy, feeling how you feel. And again, I shared this with you earlier today, Zorana. Dan Goleman once said that, what's really important is caring about how you feel. I once had this idea that, a lot of these companies that measure how people are feeling, or what the morale is like in organizations, do it like every other year, and they spend a lot of money on it. But what would it be like if you encourage every leader at every level to think really hard about how is everybody on their team feeling every day? So you paid attention to it, and you asked people to care about that. That was one of the criteria you look for when you recruited people. And one of the reasons people got to stay was because they cared about each other. When you establish that, and it really becomes real, not just a bunch of words on a piece of paper or some PowerPoint, some presentation somewhere, but you actually experience that and feel that. Again, that's another really creative way of dealing with organizational life that increases how people feel about their workplace. Why would you ever want to leave that place?
Oh, exactly. That is a very important point. And what we found in our work is what the opposite of it is when leaders are not acting in these ways, when they are ignoring even the existence of emotions. If they have this really outdated notion of professionalism as leaving emotions at the doorstep as if that was possible. It is not. The consequences are not just disengagement that you have mentioned, but we have found that the consequence is a lot of different feelings in the greater category of anger, and also feeling of being unappreciated and underappreciated.
Right. So one of the things that I want to be sure to cover a little bit is that we talked about ways to build creative confidence and plan how you wish to feel in the beginning, middle, and end of the creative process. Because I think that's what I was saying, where there's not a blueprint about how to be creative. There is a blueprint about the feelings you're likely to encounter and ways you personally might want to deal with them based on your ability to deal with uncertainty in the past. What have you learned about yourself? How you deal with anxiety, how you deal with obstacles, how you deal with frustration.
I think that's a very interesting way of putting it and quite an accurate way of putting it. We might not be able to experience only those feelings we desire to feel at a particular time, at the beginning, middle, and the end of the process. But because we never desire to feel frustration, for example, yet we will feel frustration at some point. But it's not necessarily about what we are feeling. It is what is crucial for creativity is what we are doing with those feelings that we have. And there are two really important kinds of things we can do with those feelings that we have. One is we can use them. We can harness their power to maximize what we are doing. And the other one, we can manage it. We can regulate our emotions to change their nature, change what we are feeling at a particular time, especially if it happens to be in our way. And I think it makes sense to spend little time on these concepts because they seem abstract in nature. What does it mean to use your emotions? Well, it means that different emotions are good for different kinds of thinking. So that in general, if we are in positive and energized moods, we are better able and more successful at coming up with lots of ideas and doing so quickly. And when we are in more subdued moods or more pessimistic moods, they are essentially a superpower of critical thinking. We can identify all potential problems and things that could be improved. And if you think of creativity as a process that includes both coming up with ideas and developing them and deepening them, we need both of these kinds of thinking. Therefore, we both need positive and energized moods and those more pessimistic ones. And you can plan. I like your concept of the roadmap and planning because, to give a personal example, I'm not much of a morning person, so I can plan around that. And my plan around it is that I am going to be pessimistic in the morning. So as I work on something that is being developed, and for example, a piece of writing, in the first thing in the morning, I'm going to be most critical. I'm going to find all the possible ways to improve it. And by planning to do it in the morning when I know that generally I tend to feel this,
Right.
I am going to maximize my success.
That's great. All right, I'm about to run out of time, so I want to touch on a couple of things and just say something about them. I thought it was really interesting that when people are told we're looking for you to be creative regarding a task, they actually are more creative. I'm going to ask you to comment on a couple of these. So let me say, I just want to stop and say that that's one thing to really think about. Just actually telling people you want them to be creative generates creativity. Another thing that you had said that was really interesting to me was people are much more creative when they are constrained by what they are given to work with, as opposed to just create something and work with anything. But, and I think we used the example of like some of the cooking shows where you only have a certain set of ingredients and a team of really artistic and wonderful people who are good at creating recipes, but they have to each create something unique, and they all do it. And then you also mentioned the passion. And maybe you could say just a little bit about passion. And then I want to ask you if you can tell people about where they can find your book, because you've got so much more in there that we didn't talk about. A lot about on self-regulation, on ways that you can manage when you get to these parts of the process where you get stuck or feel frustrated, things that you can do to address that. And that's all in your book. And I really enjoyed reading it. And I'm very thankful we did this. But can you just talk a little bit about passion, because you have a unique take on that, and then tell us where we can get your book, Zorana.
You have touched upon quite a few things there. Thank you for highlighting some unexpected findings by, just telling people that be creative, asking them to be creative, results in them being more creative, because essentially you're giving them the permission. You are showing them that it's expected and accepted. And when you talk about passion, we are clear, we are intuitively almost clear that passion is something that is a great motivator and great builder of creative drive. But we often get something quite wrong about passion when we talk about discovering our passion. When we speak about discovering our passion, the assumption is that it is already there. It is already in existence. It is part of us, and we just have to find it, uncover it somewhere deep inside. Quite to the contrary, passion is something that is developed, something that we can build from, this is a vague interest to me. Let me learn more about it. Let me be curious about it. And by diving into rabbit holes, we truly develop passion. We all have experience with diving into rabbit holes. And once you start thinking it like that, it becomes clear that, this is something that is developed if you try to engage with interests that can then grow.
That's very interesting. So there is some reason to dive into a rabbit hole after all. That's funny. Okay, so one other thing, how can people find your book, The Creativity Choice?
People can find the book wherever is your favorite place to find books.
Okay.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, you name it, search for The Creativity Choice, and it's going to pop. And do drop me a note if you check it out.
Thank you, Zorana. And
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zorana, for being on. This was great. Thanks for listening. I'm Chuck Wolfe, and this is the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. Bye-bye, everybody.